Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now,
yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Free at last! Free at last! Thank God Almighty! We are free at last!
Welcome to the Historian's Almanac. I'm your host, Dr. William Lester. On today's episode, the British Invasion. The British Invasion was quite simply one of the watershed developments in American popular music history. The phenomenon involved the virtual domination of AM radio and the record industry in the United States by British artists, particularly the beat groups who had proved adept at recycling the American rhythm and blues and rockabilly songs of the 1950s. The convergence of a number of events provided the appropriate setting for this onslaught. American rock and roll had been undergoing a steady decline in quality since the major record companies, aided and abetted by other media outlets, most notably Top 40 Radio and Dick Clark's American Bandstand, had harnessed it and begun releasing a tamer product. In the meantime, the British music scene appeared incapable of producing much more than pale Elvis Presley imitators like Cliff Richard, Billy Fury, and Marty Wilde, and bland pop along the lines of Mr. Ackerbilt, whose Stranger on the Shore from 1962 was one of the few British imports to make a substantial dent in the stateside charts prior to 1964. However, the pop underground in Great Britain was quietly brewing something far more potent starting in the mid-1950s. The skiffle music craze, a uniquely English form of folk revival music drawing heavily on American material, led by Lonnie Donegan, spurred the baby boomer generation to form their own bands. The most notable of these aggregates, then known by names such as the Quarrymen and the Silver Beatles, would go on to spearhead the British invasion. It's hard to imagine the invasion taking place without the Beatles. Many of the bands swept along on the Fab Four's coattails to the top of the American charts possessed no more talent than the bland teen idols they had displaced. The Beatles, however, were another matter. Three of the members, the songwriting team of John Lennon and Paul McCartney, and to a lesser extent lead guitarist George Harrison, were capable of producing first-rate material. After a brief period of covering American R&B, pop, and country standards, the group went on to compose a long string of rock classics, many of which are likely to be performed for generations to come. The band members were also all excellent musicians, thanks in large part to years spent performing in small clubs in England and Germany. Lennon and McCartney both were superb vocalists, capable of putting across rave-up rockers and introspective ballads in an equally convincing manner. Despite the band's ability, so easy to assess in retrospect, success in the United States might easily have eluded them had not conditions proved ripe for receptiveness on the part of the American public. The Beatles, under the skilled management of Brian Epstein, had attempted a number of times in 1963 to secure a hit record on the American charts. Songs like Love Me Do, From Me to You, Please Please Me, and She Loves You, all hits in the UK, had gone nowhere when released by various labels in the States. By late 1963, however, the nation was caught up in a communal sense of mourning, brought on by the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. The Beatles, with their wit and humor, along with catchy, upbeat pop songs, proved to be the perfect antidote for America's collective depression. Within a matter of weeks, in January 1964, catapulted by round-the-clock radio play and appearances on The Ed Sullivan Show, the Beatles went from complete unknowns to household names in the United States, with I Want to Hold Your Hand perched in the #1 position on the Billboard Hot 100. Record companies owning the distribution rights to earlier Beatles hits rushed them back out into the marketplace. At one point in the spring, the band held down all top 5 positions on the national singles chart. These developments made a substantial impression on the British music scene. British artists of every stripe, from beat groups to purveyors of easy listening fare, were hurriedly signed up by American labels and promoted through the mass media with a vengeance. In the weeks immediately following the appearance of the Beatles, countless other UK recording acts, some of whom had realized very little success in their own country, enjoyed heavy radio play and print coverage stateside. The first onslaught of British performers to achieve success on the American charts included Dusty Springfield, the Dave Clark Five, the Searchers, Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas, and Peter and Gordon. Perhaps of even greater importance, countless other British youths were inspired to become musicians, resulting in a steady stream of talent, which many would argue has remained undiminished to the present day. By the early summer of 1964, the floodgates had burst open. There seemed to be more British artists than American on the airwaves. Indeed, a considerable number of established American acts, to say nothing of the more marginal recording artists, virtually disappeared from the charts in 1964, some never to return. Stars suddenly thrust into the periphery of the record industry included Dion, Fats Domino, Ricky Nelson, Neil Sedaka, Connie Francis, Brenda Lee, Roy Orbison, the Everly Brothers, and Chubby Checker. Even Elvis Presley's career was sent into a tailspin. Only a handful of American artists continued to thrive in 1964 and beyond, most notably the Beach Boys and the Four Seasons. New homegrown talent found it necessary to incorporate elements of the Mersey beat sound, such as the trademark jangly guitars and seamless 3-part vocal harmonies. The garage punk and folk rock movements were particularly influenced by English rock bands. Some American groups, for example, the Beau Brummels and the Sir Douglas Quintet in 1965, found it expedient to ape the British invasion look to the extent of carefully covering up their native origins. Perhaps the most positive result of the British invasion was its role in clearing away the musical deadwood which had found a home on the American charts. With many of the long-established American acts, as well as countless lesser luminaries, unable to compete with the host of often lackluster British stars, fresh stateside talent was more readily able to garner the attention of record company executives. Within a year or two of the initial British onslaught, a new wave of American musicians had already laid the groundwork for the creative renaissance in popular music during the latter half of the 1960s. That concludes another episode of the Historian's Almanac. Thank you for listening to the program. I'd like to remind you that the show can be heard on the Historian's Almanac Facebook page and on the Blackwater Media YouTube channel. I'm Dr. William Lester, and remember, history comes alive on the Historian's Almanac.